Can you believe the most terrifying stories of human history are not found in crowded battlefields or gilded palaces, but hidden away in places so isolated the world forgot they even existed? We are talking about the Balkan Mountains, circa 1800 CE, a place where the air itself was a weapon, and the snow was not merely precipitation, it was a tombstone waiting to fall. Picture this: peaks that scraped the very belly of the heavens, villages clinging to impossible slopes like desperate barnacles, wrapped in a silence so profound it would shatter your sanity. This was the era when empires clashed far away, and up here, in the forgotten corners of existence, the true enemy wasn't an army, but the absolute, crushing weight of Mother Nature unleashed. This is the story of the village of Vranica, a tiny cluster of stone and smoke, nestled deep in a valley where the sun dared to visit only for a few grudging hours a day. A catastrophe no one saw coming was brewing beneath layers of pristine white powder, a horror so slow and insidious it was mistaken for simple, brutal winter. The winter of 1803 was not just cold, it was malevolent. The rivers froze solid, not into ice, but into a geological feature, a temporary mountain range of crystal. The snow started in October, a gentle dusting, but by mid-November it was a biblical deluge, burying houses up to their chimney stacks and erasing the trails that had linked these small communities for centuries. The routes were impassable. The passes were sealed shut by drifts taller than any man, reinforced by sheets of deadly, unpredictable ice. Vranica was officially gone from the map of the living. Imagine the terror of realizing that the rope connecting you to civilization has been deliberately, violently severed. No messengers could pass. No trade could happen. The villagers, hardened by generations of mountain life, knew the drill. Hunker down, ration, pray to the ancient gods that the stores would last until the thaw. But this year, the deep sleep of the mountains was disturbed. Something was awake, and it was ravenously hungry. The first sign, always subtle, always deniable, was the disappearance of the livestock. Not sudden mass killings, which would suggest a wolf pack, but quiet, methodical vanishing acts. A sheep gone here, a goat gone there. The shepherds, men who could read the mountain winds like a sacred text, swore the tracks were wrong, too clean, too perfectly spaced, too human, yet impossibly large. Then came the unsettling silence from the neighboring valley, the village of Krustov. They were only a day's hard trek away in summer, a crucial link for shared resources. But for 3 weeks, no smoke rose from their valley, no sound carried across the frozen peaks. The isolation magnified every fear. Every shadow stretching across the snow became a lurking monster. Every howl of the wind became a desperate warning that civilization was dissolving around them. The elders whispered about old curses, about things that the Ottoman pashas had sealed away in the high peaks, things that the cold had finally released. It was the young hunter, Grigor, the quickest and arguably the most foolish man in Vranica, who decided he couldn't wait any longer. Their stores were dwindling, the fear was spreading faster than any illness, and he knew they needed answers from Krustov, even if those answers were terrifying. He strapped on his massive, heavy snowshoes, wrapped himself in layers of coarse wool and thick furs, and carrying a meager pack of dried meat and a heavy Ottoman musket, he set out to breach the wall of snow and find the neighboring village. His mother begged him to stay, clutching the cross and whispering old mountain superstitions about the Vukodlak, the creature that walks when the world sleeps. But Grigor dismissed it as old women's tales meant to keep children from the woods. He spent 2 agonizing days fighting the snow, navigating landscapes that looked alien even to him, utterly transformed by the white, crushing blanket. The silence was deafening. The cold was a physical weight pressing against his lungs, forcing him to fight for every meager breath. He finally reached the ridge overlooking Krustov late on the second afternoon, his body screaming in protest. What he saw next was not merely a village buried in snow. It was a scene of petrified violence, a tableau that defied logic and froze the blood in his veins, a sight that confirmed the absolute reality of the unseen threat. It was stained with a deep rust-colored red, stretching out in patterns that suggested not random slaughter, but a deliberate, methodical drainage of life. And then there was the smell. Not the metallic scent of fresh blood, but something ancient, sickly sweet, like decaying honey mixed with burnt cedar, and the awful stench of unwashed grave dirt. Grigor didn't need to enter the houses to know what had happened. The fear hit him like a physical blow. Grigor didn't need to enter the houses to know what had happened. The fear hit him like a physical blow, stripping him of his breath and his courage, making his strong legs feel like water. He saw a single, massive footprint pressed deep into a frozen patch near the well, a footprint that confirmed the shepherd's terrifying suspicions. It was the shape of a man's boot, but scaled up to an impossible size, heavy enough to crush rock, deep enough to suggest a weight that no mortal body could possibly possess. A truly colossal creature that moved with terrifying stealth. He turned, abandoning his mission, the dried meat, and the concept of rational thought. He fled back toward Vranica, the image of those crimson stains burning into his soul like a brand. But the mountain, this ancient, cruel sentinel, was not done with him yet. As he scrambled back up the ridge, fighting the treacherous ice, the sun vanished. But the mountain, this ancient, cruel sentinel, was not done with him yet. As he scrambled back up the ridge, fighting the treacherous ice, the sun vanished, plunging the world into a lethal, pitch-black night. And that's when he heard it, a sound that was neither wolf nor wind, neither avalanche nor human scream, a low, guttural roar that carried the promise of unstoppable, predatory hunger. echoing from the shadowed entrance of the very pass he needed to escape through. Vrnitsa was next, and the monster was already blocking the door. The snow-choked pass, the only artery leading Vrnitsa to the outside world, did not just look impassable. It radiated a cold, malignant intelligence. Vrnitsa, his lungs burning with the panicked effort of his retreat from the horror of Stanitsa, stumbled backward, the skeletal trees around him seeming to twist into monstrous sentinels of fate. He knew with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the glacial wind that this white wall, this impossible drift of ice and stone, was not merely a natural obstruction. It was a cage, meticulously constructed by a patient, ancient architect of doom. The raw, guttural evidence he had witnessed in the silent, frozen village of Stanitsa, the bodies contorted not by cold, but by sheer, unimaginable force. The specific clinical way the vital essences had been drawn out screamed a single terrible truth. Whatever was hunting them possessed strength that defied the laws of man and beast alike. The creature was not trapped by the winter, it was empowered by it. The frigid air was its shield, the deep snow its silent highway. He spun around, abandoning the futile hope of escape, realizing his only remaining duty was the most terrifying one, running back into the jaws of the trap to warn his own people. Every meter of the return journey was a battle against the mountain's crushing weight. The path he had taken hours earlier now felt like a desperate uphill swim through liquid ice. His mind screamed for speed, but the snow held him, dragging at his heavy leather boots like grasping hands from the underworld. When he finally burst into the heart of Vrnitsa, the small cluster of stone and timber cottages huddled around the central hearth, the scene was one of deceptive, deadly peace. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, and the mundane sound of the blacksmith's hammer echoed briefly before being swallowed by the pervasive silence. He did not simply walk. He collapsed through the heavy oak door of the Kmet's house, a wreck of frozen leather and wild, desperate sound. "The pass is sealed," he shrieked, his voice raw, struggling against the ice forming on his beard. "Stanitsa is gone. Not wolves, not sickness. Something else." The Kmet, old Joven, a man carved from the same unforgiving granite as the mountains themselves, merely frowned, stirring the bubbling stew hanging over the fire. These isolated mountain villages bred a fierce, almost arrogant skepticism towards anything that couldn't be killed with an axe or bartered with silver.
"Snow-blind Vrnitsa," Jovan rumbled, his voice heavy with mountain fatigue. "The cold plays tricks. We are used to death here." But Vrnitsa was beyond reason. He yanked the Kmet's massive arm, forcing him outside, pointing desperately back towards the murderous white horizon. He didn't just tell them what he saw. He forced the horror onto them, describing the unnatural stillness of Stanitsa, the way the doors had been violently ripped outward, not broken inward, suggesting a terrifying inward pressure upon their very structure.
He detailed the chilling discovery of the last man he saw, not frozen in fear, but frozen in the middle of a desperate, futile swing. His axe buried deep into a supporting wooden beam, suggesting he fought something invisible, something that moved faster than the human eye could track. Slowly, the easy skepticism curdled into a cold, knotting fear that began to constrict the air in the small village square. The mountain people knew the signs of wolves, and they knew the signs of starvation. This was the sign of something ancient and fundamentally wrong, something that belonged to the forgotten myths whispered only in the deepest blizzards. Jovan, finally seeing the truth in Vernitsa's frantic, bloodshot eyes, turned toward the passes. He didn't need to check. He knew that if Vernitsa said the passes were sealed, they were sealed with the finality of a tomb. The isolation, once their defense against the Ottoman Empire and the petty banditry of the lowlands, had become their fatal flaw. They were islands in an ocean of lethal, unyielding white. There would be no help. There would be no escape. The few rusty muskets were pulled from storage. The axes were sharpened against the rough stone. They were farmers and shepherds, not soldiers, and their pathetic array of defense felt less like preparation and more like an offering to a colossal, hungry god. The true terror arrived not with a roar, but with a descent into absolute silence, as the last natural sounds of the evening, a dog barking, the creak of a wagon wheel, were simply erased from the air, as if swallowed by a gigantic, unseen sponge. This was the sign, the locals whispered, of the Zimski Glasnik, the winter messenger, a creature of legend said to walk only when the cold was pure enough to freeze the breath of life itself. They had dismissed it as a cautionary tale. Now, it was breathing down their necks. They barred the doors and stacked furniture against the windows, a desperate, pathetic attempt to hold back a force that Vernitsa knew could tear the very foundation stones from the ground. Every eye was fixed on the weakest point, the perimeter of the village, where the manicured snow met the wild, limitless drifts. And then it came. It wasn't a crash or a howl or the sound of footsteps. It was a pressure, a deep, bone-vibrating resonance that traveled through the frozen earth and up into the soles of their feet, shaking the very timbers of the Knet's house. It sounded like the mountain itself was shifting its massive, icy bulk, rearranging the world outside to make room for its catastrophic hunger. The single terrifying truth sank into the collective consciousness of Vernitsa. The entity had arrived, and it was significantly larger than any building they were hiding inside. The first strike against the outer wall of the nearest barn was not a blow, but a terrible, sickening shove, a force so immense that the thick wooden logs groaned in surrender, splintering inward with a sound like cannon fire, signaling the cataclysmic end of their fragile sanctuary. The monster was not trying to break in. It was simply moving the obstacle out of its way, asserting its primordial right to the space, and the next thing it moved would be them. The realization hit Vuka like a block of frozen stone. They had been fighting a ghost. Not just a powerful beast, but something that fundamentally ignored the laws of physical resistance they understood. The massive logs they had painstakingly dragged and stacked against the heavy oak door had not just been pushed aside, they had been cleaved, snapped like dry twigs under a force no mere bear or pack of wolves could ever generate. The air inside the cabin tasted of ash and fear, thick enough to choke on, and every breath they took felt like a betrayal of the dead silence outside, a silence that meant the thing was still nearby, watching their desperate, futile movements. Vuka gripped the cold iron of the village elder's ceremonial axe, its edge dulled by generations of use, knowing it was little more than a kitchen knife against this mountain demon. He knew the creature wasn't attacking yet because it simply hadn't decided to, treating their existence as an inconvenience rather than a threat demanding immediate attention. "We stay, we die." His voice was a raw whisper, cutting through the panicked murmurs of the huddled families. "We run. We might die, but we choose the direction." The logic was brutal, yet inescapable. They could not survive another night under the protection of walls that meant nothing. Their only chance lay in movement, in finding a sanctuary that wasn't already designated as the creature's feeding ground. But where? The mountains stretched out, an infinite white void of freezing death, capable of killing them faster than any monster. The nearest known settlement was Latar, a small cluster of stone huts, a day's desperate trek through the treacherous high passes. And Zlatar hadn't sent smoke signals, or trade wagons, or even a desperate runner in weeks. That silence had been the first ominous whisper of the horror that now stood outside their own door. Vuka had to know. If Zlatar had been targeted, the survivors, if any existed, might have fled with knowledge, or at least left behind clues about the entity's weakness. It was a fool's errand wrapped in a death wish, but the alternative was waiting for the inevitable crack of the door frame. Moving under the pale, malignant light of the winter sun was itself an act of defiance against the natural order. They moved with the terrifying knowledge that every second they spent in the open was a second the creature could easily observe, track, and eliminate them. The snow was knee-deep and treacherous, hiding unseen crevasses and slick ice beneath its soft, deadly surface. Every crunching step was magnified tenfold in the desolate quiet, sounding like cannon fire to their hyper-vigilant ears, announcing their vulnerability to the entire frozen amphitheater of the mountains. The cold was a physical assailant, biting at exposed skin, turning their exhaled breaths into instant clouds of vapor that froze onto their eyelashes. These were people accustomed to brutal winters, yet this felt different, a profound, deep chill that seemed to suck the very warmth from their bones, not just their skin. It was the temperature of the grave, a climate the creature seemed to thrive in, granting it an invisibility that the blinding white landscape reinforced. They moved in a tight, terrified line, keeping to the ancient, barely visible animal trails that threaded through the spruces, their heads constantly swiveling. They were not just scanning for movement, they were scanning for absence, for a shadow that shouldn't be there, for a silence that was too perfect, too absolute. signifying the monster's proximity. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking Zlatar late that afternoon, the sight did not bring relief. It brought the final, crushing wave of despair. The village was there, physically intact, an entire cluster of stone and wood buildings, seemingly untouched by fire or siege. There were no collapsed roofs, no signs of a struggle visible from this distance, just perfect, deadly stillness. It was the order that was terrifying. If raiders had come, there would be destruction. If a wildfire, smoke. If an avalanche, debris. But Zlatar looked preserved, frozen in time, like a macabre, abandoned museum dedicated to a forgotten way of life. It was too quiet, too clean, indicating a cleanup so meticulous it bordered on the psychotic. Vuka signaled for the others to remain concealed, their bodies shivering not just from the cold, but from the psychological shock of the unnatural silence, and descended alone into the valley of the damned. He moved slowly, weapon raised, every nerve screaming that he was walking directly into a trap set by something inhumanly patient. The first hut was unlocked. The inside was spotless. Tools lay neatly stacked by the hearth. A half-knitted shawl rested on a stool, and a pot still hung over the cold ashes, suggesting the inhabitants had simply vanished mid-activity. But on the dirt floor, Vuka saw the first true sign of what had transpired, and it made him physically recoil. A perfect, circular patch of dark, dried crimson, where a person must have stood, meticulously wiped clean everywhere else. He entered the church, the center of their spiritual life, and found the ultimate, terrifying clue. The heavy wooden altar rail had been ripped clean out of the stone floor, splintered horizontally near the base, not violently shattered, but torn with precise surgical force, and carved crudely into the remaining stone foundation, freshly scored through the moss and grime, were symbols Vuka did not recognize, yet his soul knew. Ancient markings, alien glyphs that spoke of terrible cold and fathomless time, a signature left by a primal intelligence. This wasn't a beast. It was a hunter with rituals, leaving cryptic warnings that only the mountain itself could truly understand. Vuka rushed back towards his group, the dread now replaced by a chilling realization of the scope of the enemy. They weren't fighting a wild animal seeking food. They were fighting an entity that had claimed this territory for millennia, a silent, ice-born architect of terror that used the mountain as its playground. As he scrambled back up the slope, his foot kicked something loose from the snow near the path, a small wooden toy horse, painted brightly, belonging to a child from Zlatar. He picked it up, his hand shaking violently, and beneath it, clearly pressed into the ice and freshly formed snow, was a single, massive, three-toed footprint, perfectly defined, impossibly large, and deeply embedded in the frozen earth. It wasn't leading towards Zlatar, confirming the horror had already completed its gruesome task here. It was leading away. and it was pointed directly back toward his own terrified, exposed group, waiting just beyond the ridge, suggesting the creature knew exactly where they were and had simply let them proceed to this horrifying discovery before circling back to claim its next prize. The final hunt had officially begun, and they were the only pieces left on the board. The air itself felt heavy, not with snow, but with the residue of absolute terror, a sickening, metallic chill that clung to their lungs and froze the blood in their veins. Pavel and Dmitri didn't speak. There was no need for words when the raw, primal instinct to flee screamed louder than any winter wind, demanding immediate escape from the ruinous silence of the neighboring settlement. They ran from that frozen, silent monument to death, realizing with horrifying clarity that the creature hadn't been hunting them casually. It had been deliberately herding them, guiding them like stray lambs to witness the sheer scope of its terrifying capability. The predator wanted them to know what awaited them, savoring the inevitable return trip and the psychological dread that now rode on their shoulders like a phantom burden. Every single step was an agonizing betrayal of vital energy they desperately needed to conserve, sinking deep into the fresh, untracked snow that swallowed sound and magnified the terrifying vulnerability of their position. The brutal geography of the Balkans, usually a stern protector against invading armies, had now become the perfect, sprawling kill zone for whatever ancient horror lurked invisible within the white void of the mountain passes. They traveled by sheer instinct, eyes constantly darting toward the impossibly dark, contorted silhouettes of the massive pine trees. Trees that looked less like vegetation and more like skeletal sentinels standing eternally watch over an unending glacial grave. It was Dmitri, the younger man whose nerves were tauter than a bowstring, who first saw it, and the sight nearly stopped his heart. A brief, unnatural disturbance in the pristine snow line off sharply to their left. It was too large for a wolf, too precise and deep for the random action of the wind, and though quickly blurred by the continuous light snowfall, the sheer size of the track was unmistakable in its depth and chilling stride. Something impossibly massive and heavy had crossed their path, moving laterally with shocking, effortless speed, covering ground they would need a full hour to traverse. The horror was not that it was tracking them, but that it was moving parallel to them, pacing their desperate flight through the mountains, calculating the precise, most dramatic moment to execute its inevitable strike. They were being measured for their graves, their exhaustion factored into the equation of their demise. Hours later, stumbling out of a blinding, dizzying snow squall, the familiar sight of their own village, Vukovar, was supposed to bring overwhelming relief, but its appearance only amplified the overwhelming dread. The familiar, sturdy outlines of the smokehouse and the crooked bell tower looked pitifully small and agonizingly fragile against the backdrop of the vast, oppressive mountain range that had suddenly become their cage. They slammed the heavy outer gate shut, the sound echoing hollowly in the sudden, brief silence that followed, and raced through the narrow, snow-choked streets, screaming warnings that were instantly muffled by the thick, insulating logs and heavy thatch of the roofs. The villagers, already burdened by the relentless, suffocating siege of the deep winter, emerged from their homes, their faces etched with confusion that quickly curdled into stark, disbelieving terror as Pavel recounted the silent, grotesque massacre they had witnessed miles away. There was initial, paralyzing panic, of course, a shockwave of hysteria threatening to shatter the already brittle nerves of the isolated community. But the Balkan spirit, tempered by generations of unforgiving winters and relentless hardship, quickly wrestled the chaos into grim, steely determination. They were vulnerable, yes, but they were also profoundly stubborn, descendants of hardy warriors who had learned long ago to fight the shadows on their own brutal terms. Quick, desperate decisions were made. Every single entrance, no matter how small, every window, every crevice, every loose board was to be immediately barred, bolted, and sealed tight with frozen mud and heavy, irreplaceable stones. Firewood, their most precious commodity, typically hoarded for survival, was piled high in the central square, intended not for warmth, but for massive, roaring defensive bonfires. Primitive, crucial light against the lightless evil they knew was fast approaching. Old Mother Anya, the village elder, whose deep-set eyes held the wisdom and trauma of 90 savage winters, started chanting the ancient, forgotten protections, scattering dried, pungent herbs that smelled faintly of sage and utter despair across the thresholds and windowsills. She spoke in low, trembling tones of the Krvavi Duch, the blood spirit, an ancient, murderous mountain tale whispered only when the cold was truly, catastrophically murderous. A creature that feasts not just on flesh, but on the very heat and life force of a thriving community. These preparations were not defenses against ordinary threats like wolves or human bandits. These were futile, desperate, theatrical gestures against a force that defied human physics and challenged deeply held faith. They knew deep down, in the core of their shivering souls, that no amount of prayer or charred wood would stop something capable of ripping massive, century-old oak timbers apart, like damp, discarded paper. As the last sliver of weak, pathetic winter sunlight finally vanished behind the treacherous, jagged peaks, plunging Vukova into an abyss of crushing cold and suffocating shadow, the true, terrible nature of their predicament crystallized into a singular truth. They were not merely survivors waiting for help. They were defined, calculated bait, meticulously placed inside a flimsy wooden trap, awaiting the hunter's inevitable, calculated return. The wind outside picked up dramatically, no longer sounding like a natural, benevolent phenomenon, but like a monstrous, slow, deliberate inhalation, seemingly drawing the very air, hope, and warmth out of the small, terrified cluster of homes. Every man, woman, and older child stood a silent, agonizing watch, weapons clutched tightly, axes, pitchforks, rusted hunting rifles, staring relentlessly into the absolute darkness that had now become a tangible, breathing, living threat. The moment had arrived. The final pursuit had stopped being a chaotic chase and was now transforming into a grim, patient siege. And the deep, unsettling, absolute silence surrounding Vukovar was 1,000 times more terrifying than any roar or shriek. It was the sound of something enormous, impossibly patient, and terrifyingly ancient, finally settling in to dine. The return of the scouts was not a moment of relief, but the entry of contagion. They stumbled back into Petrovo, their faces rigid masks of frozen terror, carrying not just the dreadful news, but the sheer weight of Vukovar's annihilation pressing down on their sanity. Mladen, the elder, gripped the younger scout, Stefan, demanding the truth. But the boy could only shudder, his eyes rolling back to reveal the pure white sclera of a man who had stared into absolute, cosmic wrongness. It wasn't until Mladen's own son, Dragan, spoke, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that cut through the silence of the crowded church, that the magnitude of the horror was understood. Vukovar had not been attacked. It had been unmade. The destruction was total, yet silent. No screams, no signs of a struggle against a conventional enemy, just the impossible spectacle of homes reduced to fine pulverized dust. Dragan described how the massive, centuries-old stone foundations had been torn up as if they were roots, then ground down to grit. The sheer force required defied every known law of physics and construction. It was the signature of a geological event, but one enacted with a purposeful, malicious precision. The wood was not burned, it was sheared across the grain. The structural integrity of the entire village simply negated in an instant of impossible pressure. The predator was not merely strong. It possessed a structural understanding of its prey's defenses that was horrifyingly sophisticated. It didn't break the door. It dissembled the house. And then came the detail that truly broke the morale of the gathered villagers. The perfect, unnatural silence. The snow blanket over Vukovar was pristine, undisturbed, save for the heaps of pulverized debris, concealing any tracks or trails leading either in or out. How does a creature massive enough to crush granite move through feet of fresh snow without leaving even a ripple? It defied the very nature of existence on the mountainside. Mladen ordered the immediate mobilization of every piece of iron in Petrovo. Scythes, cooking pots, heavy hinges, anything metal was dragged to the forge, where Dragan, the blacksmith, watched the proceedings with the vacant stare of a man preparing for the end of the world. Iron, according to the oldest whispered myths of the Balkans, held a cold sanctity, a primal resistance to the things that dwelled between worlds. But even the villagers knew that their ancestral protections felt flimsy against a force that commanded the landscape itself. The terrifying realization began to dawn. The beast was not in the mountains. It was the mountain, stirring from a slumber far deeper than the Ice Age. The extreme cold, which had intensified dramatically since the discovery of Vukovar's fate, was not just weather anymore. It was a siege weapon. Mladen believed the creature used the isolation and the freezing temperatures to slow the reflexes and dull the minds of its victims, preparing them for the kill. He ordered every scrap of dried meat and salted fish into the church, barricading the heavy oak doors not just with timbers, but with every heavy piece of furniture available, creating a defensive perimeter that felt pathetically fragile. Inside the sanctuary, fear turned inward, breeding paranoia. The flickering tallow candles cast dancing shadows that played tricks on traumatized eyes. Every creak of the aging roof beams, every moan of the wind, sounded like the shifting of something impossibly heavy right outside the walls. Was it waiting? Was it watching? The elders insisted that the creature fed on fear, and the villagers were now force-feeding it with the sheer terror of their isolation. They began the ancient rhythmic Slavic chants to Perun, the thunder god, pleading for a tempest, for noise, for anything to shatter the terrible, crushing silence that the predator had imposed on the valley. They desperately needed the chaotic sound of thunder to disrupt the creature's calculated, silent approach. But all they received was the rhythmic, maddening drip of melting ice from the eaves, ticking down the life of Petrovo. Hours later, Stefan, the scout who had been speechless, finally found his voice, shaking Mladen awake with renewed, urgent panic. He had remembered seeing something small, utterly insignificant, near the ruins of the Vukovar well. It was a patch of snow, impossibly, unnaturally black. Not soot, not ash, but a dense, inky corruption that seemed to actively absorb the light. Mladen, driven by a desperate curiosity, scraped a sample onto a piece of birch bark and brought it back. The substance was oily, unnervingly heavy, and disturbingly warm. Warmer than the air, warmer than any living thing should be in this cold. It was not blood, nor waste in the conventional sense. It was a residue, a byproduct of the creature's existence, and the horrible truth struck Mladen with the force of a frozen sledgehammer. The thing didn't just consume the houses, it consumed the heat. The immense, unnatural cold that enveloped the valley was deliberately manufactured. A thermal vacuum created by the creature absorbing all available caloric energy to fuel its unimaginable strength. Petrovo wasn't just suffering from the harsh winter. It was trapped inside a zone of absolute zero, a killing ground crafted by an entity that saw warmth as sustenance and humanity as kindling. The great, ancient machine was now fully active, and the thermal vacuum was slowly, deliberately tightening around the church. Petrovo was next on the menu, and the monster was ensuring its dinner would be perfectly chilled. The dawn brought no hope, only a blinding, brittle light that emphasized the scale of their trap. The village elder, old Father Dmitri, clutched the ice-rimmed crucifix, the wood feeling suspiciously slick, as if coated in a thin layer of venomous frost. They knew the cold was no longer simply a weather condition. It was the breath of the enemy itself, a creeping, deliberate murder weapon aimed right at the heart of their community. The silence was the worst part of the ordeal. It was not the natural, muffled quiet of a deep winter, but a suffocating, unnatural void where all sound seemed to be absorbed instantly, leaving only the painful, ringing echo of their own terrified pulses inside their skulls. Every gust of wind whistling down from the highest jagged peaks now sounded less like nature's sigh and more like a long, rattling, rasping inhalation, preparing the lethal environment for the final, fatal draw. The men, the few remaining able-bodied souls who hadn't succumbed to hypothermia or panic, hastily reinforced the church, the only stone structure in Petrovo capable of potentially resisting the monumental elemental assault. They piled every scrap of timber, every heavy chair, and every salvaged door against the massive oak entrance, creating a barricade that was far more psychological comfort than actual defense, against a power that commanded the very structure of the air itself. They were trying to build walls against gravity. Young Ivan, the blacksmith's apprentice, still reeling from the memory of his cousin's vanishing act into the thermal void, insisted on heating every available metal tool: shovels, massive iron pokers, tongs, and even rusty horseshoes, hoping that intense, localized heat, the absolute opposite of the creature's domain, might offer some minuscule, symbolic resistance against the coming doom. The air inside the makeshift sanctuary became thick and acrid, with the smell of scorched iron, damp wool, and desperate fear. A volatile, primal incense burning before an indifferent, ancient altar. They tried to light more fires in the central hearth, but the chopped wood seemed suspiciously resistant, spitting and smoking with a terrible reluctance, rather than burning brightly, as if the cold had seeped into the very core of the timber itself, denying them the warmth they craved, denying them the very principle of fire. Dmitri felt a terrifying, chilling clarity pierce his panic. The creature wasn't just living in the cold, it was actively enforcing it. An apex thermodynamic predator, actively suppressing all thermal energy around its intended prey with impossible precision. This was why the ice was so strange, so immediate, so absolute. That evening, just as the sun dipped beneath the mountains, the temperature dropped with impossible, physics-defying speed. It didn't fall gradually in the way of a winter night. It plunged instantaneously. The small windows, already sealed with thick, frozen animal hides, began to shudder and then shimmer with a sudden, violent crystallization that looked like thick structural glass forming in seconds. The stored water in the wooden barrels, their precious reserves, didn't simply freeze. The barrels cracked wide open, not through the slow, gentle expansion of ice, but through instantaneous, explosive crystallization, sending shards of ice and frozen wood across the floor like shrapnel. This was not winter anymore. This was a localized, focused apocalypse, a deliberate, lethal demonstration of absolute thermodynamic control wielded by a sentient, malicious force. Outside, the very snow seemed to recoil from the church's walls, forming strange, shifting, wind-whipped patterns that looked terrifyingly like skeletal fingers scratching at the frozen ground, beckoning them out into the lethal vacuum.
Two elderly men, old Stefan and his son Marco, who had volunteered to stand guard on the covered porch, suddenly stopped screaming. They didn't make a sound at all. The silence they left behind was the loudest sound Petrovo had ever heard. When the others cautiously peered out through a small, ice-coated knothole near the door hinge, they saw a scene of impossible, frozen brutality.
The two figures were still standing, perfectly upright, leaning against the stone wall. But they were encased entirely in glassy crystalline shells that reflected the flickering lamplight with a terrible, prismatic beauty. Their expressions of pure, silent terror were perfectly preserved in ice that looked harder and sharper than any flint weapon. They had been flash frozen, instantly, their very cellular structure arrested in milliseconds. The thermal collapse field was now fully active and collapsing inward with crushing, deliberate pressure. The ambient temperature inside the church dropped catastrophically below the 0 point, making every single breath a burning, painful gasp that scorched their lungs with crystalline air. The precious oil lamps flickered violently, their small flames shrinking down to tiny, despairing blue points of light, struggling desperately against the overwhelming, cold suction that threatened to extinguish them entirely. The creature hadn't needed to break down the massive oak door. It was simply waiting for them to freeze in place or to panic and run out into the perfectly lethal embrace of the blizzard it had expertly manufactured for its dinner preparation. Dmitri, his breath clouding heavier than ever before, even as it left his mouth, realized the monster's method. This entity derived its fundamental strength not from the crude, visceral spilling of blood, but from the elegant, absolute cessation of life. The perfect, silent stillness of thermal death. One woman, Maria, driven violently mad by the searing, freezing pain and the sight of her neighbor's horrifying ice statues, bolted. She tore at the barricade with a sudden, inhuman strength, fueled purely by primal terror, screaming a desperate prayer that was instantly choked off and muted by the sub-zero air pressure as she ripped the door ajar. They heard a single, terrible, wet crunch from outside the opening, followed by an immediate, profound, and final silence. She was gone. The breach she created was too wide, too dangerous to fix immediately, and the cold poured in like a physical, tangible, malicious liquid, hugging the stone floor,
actively seeking out the concentrated warmth of their huddled bodies.
The monster had not laid a single claw upon them, yet 3 more were dead, victims of the specialized environment it wielded like a legendary scythe. Dmitri understood the ancient, terrifying legend now. He who guards the threshold of the mountain needs no claw, only the terrifying patience of eternal winter.
Petrovo was now effectively a high-efficiency refrigeration unit, a perfectly prepared feast. The survivors huddled closer, the faint, rapidly dissipating warmth of their clustered bodies their only shield, knowing that the agonizing moment their collective core temperature dropped too far, the silent hunter would step inside the church, not for a fight, but simply for collection. The long night was still tragically young, and the temperature was still falling toward an impossible, final 0.
The silence inside the stone chapel was not the peaceful quiet of devotion. It was the suffocating, deep-sea quiet of a vacuum. Every breath taken by the lone hunter, Ivanko, plumed out like a desperate signal flare in the frigid, oppressive air. The scent of pine and old incense had been violently replaced by something metallic, something impossibly cold, like iron dragged from the heart of a glacier. He held the sputtering, tiny tallow lantern high, the feeble light swallowing itself in the vast darkness of the vaulted ceiling. The temperature differential was shocking. It was somehow colder inside the structure than outside in the blizzard, a thermal paradox that defied natural law and whispered of unnatural influence. The stone floor, usually damped from condensation, was dry and slick, coated in a fine, glittering layer of frost that shouldn't have formed this quickly. An ephemeral crystal dust clinging to the ancient mortar lines. Ivanko's eyes, trained by a lifetime of tracking game across treacherous slopes, immediately snapped to the altar. It was undisturbed, but the floor around it told a story so horrific it threatened to freeze the blood in his veins faster than the ambient cold. There were drag marks, deep grooves scraped into the worn rock, leading from the side entrance toward the apse. These were not the haphazard trails of panic or struggle. They were deliberate, surgical tracks, suggesting immense power used with chilling efficiency. He knew instinctively what he was looking for, and dread coiled tighter than a winter serpent in his gut. The predator, whatever it was, didn't leave behind scattered remains. It left nothing but the aftermath of selection. He lowered the lantern, his hand shaking, illuminating a patch of floor where the faint, terrible crimson stain of spilled life had been instantly flash-frozen, transforming into tiny, dark, crystallized rubies stuck fast to the stone. But the body, the reason they knew someone was taken, was gone, simply removed. This was the horror, the complete clinical absence of a victim, leaving behind only the impossible cold and the evidence of unimaginable strength. This was the signature of the hunter of the deep cold, the thing the whispers called Zimmick. It didn't consume flesh in the ravenous way of a wolf. It harvested the warmth, the life force, leaving behind a perfectly chilled husk, suitable for its storage or transport. Ivanko realized the air itself was dangerous. Breathing in meant inviting the terrible cold deep into the lungs, risking immediate hypothermia, even in heavy furs. He pulled the thick wool scarf tighter over his mouth and nose, trying desperately to warm the meager air supply. He noticed a detail that made his stomach plummet. High up on the supporting beam, near the choir loft, a perfect, crystalline shard of ice, shaped like a vicious claw, was embedded deep into the aged oak wood. This was not a beast of fur and tooth. This was an architect of frost, a creature born when the mountains themselves first shuddered under the weight of the endless prehistoric snows. The ancient priests warned of this, the manifestation of winter's malice itself. He moved quickly, silently, toward the confessionals, the only place large enough to conceal a struggle, his rifle gripped so hard his knuckles were white. He found a piece of torn leather, a bootstrap, and next to it a small, intricate wooden cross belonging to the sacristan, perfectly preserved, encased in a thin layer of rime. But what truly stopped his heart was the state of the iron door leading to the crypt below. The massive locking bolt, thick as a man's forearm, hadn't been picked or broken. It had been sheared. The cut was clean, surgical, looking less like damage from a heavy axe and more like the work of a superheated, or perhaps supercooled, precision tool. The iron was cracked and warped outward, the edges brittle and shimmering with residual frost. Whatever had come into the church was now capable of accessing the deepest, most isolated parts of the village architecture, the places meant for eternal rest and safe storage. If the crypt was compromised, the sanctity of their entire defense perimeter was meaningless. He knew he had minutes, maybe seconds, before the freezing presence returned to finish its collection. He could hear nothing over the shriek of the wind outside, but he felt the shift in the air pressure, the subtle, crushing weight of an approaching cold front that was not meteorological, but biological. Ivanko spun around, ignoring the instinct to hunt, choosing survival and warning instead. He scrambled back toward the entrance, his boots crunching loudly on the fine layer of frost, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the monumental silence. He burst out of the heavy wooden doors and slammed them shut, ignoring the pain in his shoulders, and threw the massive iron bar across them. It was a futile gesture, a superstition against an entity that laughed at iron and wood, but it bought him psychological time. The blizzard outside was now a living entity, a white, screaming wall of ice needles and zero visibility. The wind howled a high-pitched, mocking lament that seemed to follow him, pushing him down the slippery path. He had to get back to Vukovar. He had to warn them that the predator wasn't simply passing through. It was targeting storage, targeting isolation, and most terrifyingly, perhaps, targeting something buried deep beneath the earth. The thought hammered into his skull. Why the crypt? What treasure could the Zimnik possibly seek amongst the bones of their ancestors, unless the terror was not just about harvesting life, but about controlling the very ground beneath their feet? He ran, sinking deep into the fresh powder with every desperate stride, the lantern long since extinguished by the gale. He was running blind, guided only by the ingrained memory of the path and the desperate, burning need to survive the impossible cold. The air was so dry and thin, it felt like breathing powdered glass. His body, trained as it was rapidly nearing its thermal limits. The extreme cold wasn't just chilling him, it was actively leaching the heat energy from his cells, a silent, invisible siphon of vitality. His fingers, even inside thick mittens, were losing sensation rapidly, turning clumsy and useless. If he fell now, if he dropped the rifle, he would be instantly consumed by the white oblivion. He could feel the ice crystals forming on the inside of his mustache, freezing his lips slightly shut every time he gasped for air. He stumbled over a partially buried rock, catching himself just before a catastrophic fall that would have ended the mission and his life instantly. It was personal now. The creature had marked the village, and Ivanko was the last warning shot. He thought of his wife, tucked safely, he hoped, inside their small stone cottage, the fire roaring high. That thought was the only warmth left in the universe. Ahead, through the blinding curtain of snow, he saw the faint flickering oil lamps of the village perimeter, a beacon of hope, but also, potentially, a deadly, isolated target, waiting for the inevitable arrival.
He pushed his legs harder, ignoring the screaming protest of his muscles. The ground beneath the deep snow was uneven, treacherous, hiding hidden crevasses and sharp, unforgiving stones. This landscape was designed to kill the unprepared, and tonight it was partnering with something ancient and evil.
He was close enough now to smell the smoke, the beautiful, pungent aroma of burning oak and pine, a scent of life and survival in the face of death. He yelled, a guttural sound torn from his frozen throat, but the wind swallowed it whole, turning his cry into a meaningless, frozen whisper.
He had to reach the palisade, bypass the sentries, and make them understand the truth. They were not fighting wolves or bandits or the usual demons of the mountain. They were fighting winter itself, materialized, enraged, and hunting for the very core of their existence.
The final stretch was a blur of exhausting effort. He saw the wooden stakes of the stockade loom before him, vast and sheltering. He slammed his body against the heavy gate, his lungs burning, his vision narrowing to a desperate tunnel. The warning had to be delivered. The temperature was still falling. And just as he was about to beat on the wood and scream the terrible news, a sound ripped through the howl of the blizzard. Not the wind, but a deep, resonating crack from the center of Vukovar. A sound that implied massive stress, a structure collapsing, or perhaps something breaking its way in. He froze, terror replacing exhaustion. Was he already too late? Had the Zimnik bypassed the church and gone straight for the heart? The collection had begun. The ultimate winter had arrived.